Over the years, my buddies and I have tackled countless trails and camped in some of the most remote spots you can imagine. But there's one trip that sticks with us. A weekend we spent in a cabin buried deep in the woods, found through some obscure online listing. What was supposed to be a fun, laid-back getaway to unplug and soak in nature turned into something straight out of a nightmare. The kind that stays with you no matter how much time passes. The plan was pretty simple. Pile into Mark's beat-up SUV, drive out to this old cabin we rented for next to nothing, and spend the weekend hiking, cooking over a campfire, and maybe swapping ghost stories. The listing had called the place rustic and secluded, which sounded perfect, just what we needed to escape the grind of our everyday lives. We hit the road early that Friday morning, 5 of us crammed into the SUV, laughing and cracking jokes as the countryside rolled by. The road twisted through small towns and sprawling farmlands before narrowing down to a single lane as we entered the woods. The trees closed in around us, forming a tunnel that grew darker the deeper we drove. Soon, there were no houses, no power lines, nothing but endless forest. The GPS was practically useless, losing signal as we veered further off the beaten path. By the time we pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself looked like it had been yanked straight out of a ghost story. Its peeling paint and sagging porch gave it an abandoned vibe, and the windows were dark and lifeless. As I stepped out of the car, a chill ran down my spine, probably from the sudden drop in temperature, or so I told myself. "Cozy, huh?" Mark joked, though his tone gave away some doubt. We all chuckled, but it was the kind of uneasy laughter people use when they're trying to convince themselves everything's fine. There was something about that cabin that just felt wrong. Still, none of us wanted to be the one to chicken out, so we grabbed our bags and headed inside. The interior wasn't much better. Dust clung to every surface, the floorboards groaned under our feet, and the air smelled stale and damp. The kitchen was tiny, outfitted with ancient appliances and a sink that looked like it hadn't seen running water in years. The living room was furnished with mismatched chairs and a worn-out couch, all facing a stone fireplace that dominated the space. A narrow staircase led up to a loft with a couple of small bedrooms. As we unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we didn't belong there, like we were trespassing. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes every sound, your footsteps, the creak of a chair, feel 10 times louder, but I brushed it off as nerves. Mark and I got a fire going while the others unpacked and set up the kitchen. Dinner was simple, hot dogs and beans, the kind of meal that always tastes better out in the woods. We ate by the fire, the flames crackling in the quiet cabin. The conversation stayed light, but there was a tension in the air that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Afterward, we decided to explore the woods around the cabin before it got too dark. The trees were thick and tightly packed, blocking out most of the remaining sunlight. We talked about hiking plans for the next day, maybe even finding a stream to fish in, but as we wandered deeper into the woods, that uneasy feeling started creeping back. The forest seemed to close in on us, the shadows stretching longer and darker with each step. Eventually, we stumbled into a small clearing, and what we saw there made us all freeze. A cluster of old, crumbling gravestones jutted out of the ground, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. There was no sign of any nearby buildings or paths, just these forgotten graves in the middle of nowhere. It was creepy, no question about it. "Well, guess we know why the cabin was so cheap," Lisa said, her voice a little too chipper. "Yeah," I replied with a forced laugh. "Nothing like a graveyard to keep the rent low." We didn't stick around long. The sun had disappeared, and the darkness seemed to press down on us as we made our way back to the cabin. By the time we got inside, that sense of dread felt like a weight in the air. We tried to shake it off by playing cards and swapping stories, but the atmosphere had shifted. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the rundown furniture look even more worn and eerie. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside had us all on edge. It felt like the cabin itself was alive, watching us, waiting for something. Then, we heard it, a faint noise outside, like someone or something moving around. It was subtle at first, a soft shuffling sound, almost like footsteps brushing against the dirt. We froze in place, our card game forgotten, and all eyes turned toward the windows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart hammering in my chest. Mark nodded, his face pale in the glow of the fire. "Yeah, probably just an animal," he said, though none of us really believed that. The sound was too deliberate, too slow to be anything wild. The noise circled the cabin, stopping now and then before picking back up again. The silence inside felt like it was crushing us, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire. "Maybe we should check it out," Mike suggested hesitantly, though he didn't sound eager to follow through. "No way," Lisa snapped, her voice sharp with fear. "We should stay inside. Whatever it is, it'll go away." But it didn't go away. The sound kept going, steady and unnerving, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted us to know it was there. It was like it wanted us scared. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, trying to look braver than I felt. "I'll go see what it is," I said, my voice trembling just a little. Aaron joined me, and together we approached the front door. The others stayed near the fireplace, their faces pale and tense. The air inside the cabin felt suffocating, thick with fear, and the sound of those relentless footsteps filled the space. We opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning like they didn't want to let us out. The cold night air hit us like a slap, and the darkness outside was so deep it felt like a solid wall. I swept the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the blackness, lighting up the porch, the trees, and the dirt path that led into the woods. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone or anything. Aaron and I exchanged a look, nervous but determined, and stepped outside. The gravel crunched loudly under our feet in the quiet. The sound had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. We circled the cabin, the flashlight's beam casting eerie, stretched shadows across the ground. But still, we found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just the vast, silent forest pressing in around us. When we went back inside, we tried to convince ourselves it was nothing, that maybe our imaginations were playing tricks on us. But deep down, we all knew better. The cabin felt different, the air heavy with a fear none of us wanted to name. We sat around the fire, pretending everything was fine, but the tension was unbearable. Finally, we decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep might ease the unease. None of us wanted to sleep upstairs, though, so we unrolled our sleeping bags in the living room, huddled near the fire for warmth and comfort. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I tried to focus on the light instead of the sounds of the cabin. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every groan of the old wood made my pulse race, my mind conjuring images of shadows moving just beyond the firelight. I could tell the others were awake too. Their breathing was quick and shallow, their bodies stiff in their sleeping bags. Just as I felt myself starting to drift off, it happened again. The sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't outside. They were coming from above us, up in the loft. Slow, deliberate steps echoed through the cabin, each one louder than the last. My heart felt like it had stopped. I couldn't even breathe. I glanced at Aaron, who was wide-eyed, staring at the ceiling. "Someone's up there," he whispered, his voice so low I barely heard it. I couldn't respond. The fear was too much. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, as if whoever, or whatever it was searching for something. The floorboards groaned under their weight, each sound magnified by the cabin's oppressive silence. Then, the steps moved toward the stairs and paused. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling fire and our panicked breathing. And then, slowly, the footsteps started descending the stairs. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but a sudden wave of urgency hit me. I knew we had to get out of there. Jumping to my feet with my heart hammering, I grabbed the flashlight. "We need to leave. Now," I said, my voice trembling. Nobody argued. Panic set in as we scrambled to gather our things, our hands fumbling and movements clumsy. The footsteps on the stairs grew louder, each one bringing them closer. We didn't wait to see who or what was coming. We bolted out the door into the freezing night air, the chill biting through our fear. Running to the car, none of us dared to glance back. Aaron's hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, but he finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, slamming them shut behind us. The engine roared to life, and Aaron floored it, gravel spraying as we sped away. The cabin quickly disappeared into the darkness behind us, swallowed by the trees. We didn't slow down until we'd put miles between us and that place. Nobody spoke for a long time, the silence in the car thick with lingering fear. Finally, when we reached the main road, Aaron broke the quiet. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my chest still tight, "but I'm not going back to find out." That night, we didn't even try to sleep. We found a run-down motel in the closest town and huddled together, still shaken. No one could make sense of what had happened, and there were no answers. Just the heavy weight of fear and the haunting memory of those footsteps on the stairs. A few summers later, I had another brush with the kind of fear that stays with you. It was different but unsettling in its own way. There's something about being out on a lake, so vast, so quiet, that can make you feel both at peace and exposed at the same time. I've always loved fishing, especially on remote lakes where it feels like the rest of the world doesn't exist. But after what happened one late summer evening, I can't shake the feeling that some places are better left alone. Mark and I had heard about this lake from some locals in a nearby town. It wasn't on any map, just a secluded spot deep in the woods. They called it a fisherman's paradise. Clear water, plenty of fish, and absolute solitude. It sounded perfect. The drive there was long and winding. The kind of road that twists through dense forests where the trees form a canopy overhead. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. The lake was breathtaking. Crystal clear water so still it mirrored the trees and sky like glass. We found a small clearing by the shore and set up camp, our tent facing the water. The first hint of fall was in the air, a slight chill brushing against us, but the sky was clear, and stars were already beginning to peek out. It was the kind of night that makes you feel alive, grateful to be away from the chaos of daily life. After settling in, we decided to get in some fishing before it got too dark. We pushed our little aluminum boat into the water, the gentle splash of the oars breaking the heavy silence. The lake was eerily quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the soft lapping of water against the boat. It was peaceful, but that stillness felt unnatural, like the whole world was holding its breath. We rowed to the middle of the lake, where the water turned deep and dark. By then, the sun had set completely, and only a faint moonlight and the soft glow of our lantern lit the way. As we cast our lines, I felt myself starting to relax. But then I noticed something, a shadow near the shore, barely visible in the fading light. At first, I thought it was just the trees playing tricks on my eyes, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became. "Hey, Mark," I whispered, keeping my voice low. "Do you see that guy over there?" Mark squinted into the darkness, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, I see him. Weird. You think he's another camper?" "I don't know," I said, my stomach tightening. "I thought we were the only ones out here." Mark shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Maybe he's just a local, checking out who's on his lake." We tried to brush it off and focus on fishing, but it was hard to ignore the man. Every time I glanced at the shore, he was still there, standing perfectly still. He wasn't holding a fishing rod or a flashlight, just standing there in the dark, watching us. After a while, the unease became too much. "This is starting to creep me out," I said, my voice shaking. "Why is he just standing there?" Mark nodded, his expression serious now. "Yeah, it's weird. Maybe we should head back to camp." I didn't argue. We reeled in our lines and I grabbed the oars, rowing us back toward the shore as quickly as I could. The whole time, I kept an eye on the man. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. When we reached the shore, we dragged the boat onto the bank. Now that we were closer, I could see him more clearly. He was tall and thin, his hair long and wild. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, like he hadn't taken them off in weeks. But it was his face that unsettled me the most. His expression was blank, completely devoid of emotion, like he wasn't really there. Mark and I exchanged a nervous glance, the same thought passing between us without a word. What the hell is going on? This guy wasn't just another camper. There was something deeply unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's just get back to the tent," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. We started walking briskly toward our campsite, our footsteps crunching on the path as we put distance between us and the lake. I couldn't resist glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting him to be following us. But he wasn't. He was still there, standing motionless on the shore, watching us go. When we finally reached the tent, our nerves were shot. The fire we'd built earlier had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim, flickering light across the campsite. We sat down, both too spooked to say much about what we'd just experienced. The silence around us was thick, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. I couldn't get his face out of my mind. Blank, emotionless, like he wasn't fully human. I kept trying to rationalize it, telling myself he was just some strange local, maybe someone who lived nearby. But deep down, I knew better. After a long stretch of silence, Mark finally spoke, his voice strained. "We should have just asked him what he was doing." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. But what if he wasn't harmless? We both knew the answer, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. The isolation, the darkness, and the fact that we were miles from any other people made us feel more vulnerable than ever. Out here, if something went wrong, no one was coming to help us. We tried to distract ourselves by cooking a quick dinner over the dying fire, but the unease hung over us like a heavy cloud. Our eyes kept darting to the shadows just beyond the firelight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After eating, we decided to call it a night, hoping that sleep would dull the edge of our nerves. But as I lay there in the tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The wind rustled the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I listened intently, straining to hear anything out of place. At first, it was just the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like something lightly brushing against the side of the tent. My eyes snapped open, and my chest tightened as my heart began to race. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. Then the sound came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I reached over and shook Mark awake, my hand trembling. "Mark, wake up. Do you hear that?" Mark groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" Before I could answer, the tapping came again, more insistent this time. We both froze, staring at the side of the tent where the sound was coming from. "Who's out there?" Mark called, his voice shaking. No response, just the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. Then, after a moment of silence, the tapping stopped. We sat there in the dark, holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The only sound was the wind, whistling through the trees. Finally, Mark grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, the zipper's rasp cutting through the tense silence. He shone the light outside, sweeping it across the campsite. There was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the lake. But then the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the lake to our tent and then back again. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. Someone had been outside our tent, watching us while we slept. Fear took over. We scrambled out of the tent, moving as fast as we could to pack up our gear. The thought of staying even a minute longer was unbearable. As we worked, I kept glancing nervously toward the lake, half expecting to see the man standing there again. But the shoreline was empty, the water still and silent. It was as if he'd disappeared into thin air. We didn't say much as we packed, our movements hurried and panicked. The serene beauty of the lake had transformed into something menacing, and all we could think about was getting out. The drive back to town was tense, the silence in the truck thick with fear. The road twisted through the forest, the trees casting long, dark shadows in the moonlight. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind us, but the road stayed empty. It wasn't until we reached the main highway, with the faint lights of the town visible in the distance, that I finally felt a small measure of relief. The relief of reaching the main highway was undeniable, but the fear still lingered, like a shadow clinging to the edges of my mind. Mark and I never talked about that night again. We didn't need to. Whatever happened at that lake wasn't something either of us wanted to relive. Yet, even now, the memory refuses to let go. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. I don't know why he was watching us, why he came so close to our tent, or what he was trying to accomplish. But I do know this. The fear I felt that night, the chilling certainty of being watched, has stayed with me. Even though I've done my best to bury it, the image of his blank stare and those fresh footprints outside our tent haunt me. They remind me that, sometimes, even in the middle of nowhere, you're not as alone as you think. I've been a land surveyor for nearly 20 years now, working in some of the most remote places imaginable. I've faced wild animals, sudden storms, and equipment failures in the middle of nowhere. But nothing in all my experience prepared me for what happened under that bridge in the Arizona desert. It was the kind of encounter that worms its way into your thoughts, creeping back when you least expect it, reminding you how small and vulnerable you really are. It was mid-July, the kind of scorching day where the heat seems to press down on you like a physical weight, and the sun is relentless, baking everything it touches. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly around me, a barren expanse of sand, rocks, and scrub brush. Cacti dotted the landscape, but they did little to break the monotony. The sky was a cloudless, brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. I'd been sent to survey an old bridge spanning a dry riverbed about 50 miles outside of Phoenix. It wasn't glamorous work, just a routine check for structural integrity, measuring wear and tear to ensure it was still up to code. The bridge, probably built in the 1960s, hadn't seen much traffic in years. It stood isolated, far from any main road or town, which suited me just fine. I preferred working alone, driving down a dusty, narrow road that snaked through the desert. My truck kicked up clouds of red dirt in its wake. The radio fizzled with static as I got farther from civilization, but I didn't mind. The silence of the desert was comforting. Just the wind and, occasionally, the piercing cry of a hawk overhead. By midday, I reached the bridge. The sun hung high in the sky, turning the earth into a blistering oven. I parked my truck on the shoulder, grabbed my gear, and got to work. The bridge looked its age, rust eating at the metal beams, cracks running through the concrete, and a layer of dust so thick it seemed untouched for years. As I moved underneath to inspect the supports, something caught my eye. Tucked away in the shadows under the structure was an old dumpster. It was strange, completely out of place in the middle of the desert. Who would haul a dumpster all the way out here, and why? Curiosity got the better of me. I approached it cautiously. The dumpster was battered and rusted, covered in faded graffiti. A faint, foul smell wafted from it, like something had been left to rot inside for far too long. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I lifted the lid, my heart thudding in my chest, expecting to find little more than old trash. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. Inside were piles of tattered clothes, filthy blankets, and empty food containers. It was clear someone had been living here, using the dumpster as a makeshift shelter. But that wasn't what sent chills up my spine. Etched into the metal walls of the dumpster were crude, unsettling drawings. Distorted faces with hollow eyes, twisted bodies, and strange, unrecognizable symbols scratched deep into the rusted surface. My first thought was that a drifter, someone down on their luck, had turned this secluded spot into a hideout. It wasn't uncommon to stumble upon makeshift camps in remote areas, but this felt different, desperate, unhinged. A cold unease settled over me as I backed away, my pulse quickening. I didn't want to be here anymore. I needed to finish my inspection and get out, fast. I forced myself to focus on the job, trying to shake the gnawing sense of dread, but I couldn't help glancing back at the dumpster every so often, half expecting someone to emerge from its dark, shadowed interior. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, crunching on gravel. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid as the footsteps grew louder, each crunch on the gravel sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from the bridge to the vast desert surrounding me, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound stopped. For a moment, The only noise was the wind whistling through the dry riverbed. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure emerged from behind the dumpster. It was a man. His clothes were filthy, his hair wild and matted, and his frame thin to the point of looking unhealthy. He had a crazed, hollow look in his eyes that made my stomach knot. He stood there for a moment, staring at me, his expression unreadable, before taking a step forward. My heart shot into my throat. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but everything about him screamed danger. I instinctively backed away, trying to keep some distance between us, but he kept moving toward me, his pace quickening. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could hear it waver. "I'm just doing my job here. I'll be out of your way in a minute." He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on me, and there was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl, a wild, unhinged intensity like he was barely holding on to reality. Panic bubbled up inside me as I realized the truck was parked just a few yards away, but he was between me and it. I couldn't afford to turn my back on him, but staying put wasn't an option either. The job didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was getting out of there alive. Then, he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, and uneven, like he hadn't used it in a long time. "This is my place," he said, his words slurred and broken. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm sorry," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm and non-threatening. "I didn't know. I'll leave right now, okay?" But he didn't stop. He kept coming, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes burned with some dark, unreadable emotion that set every nerve in my body on edge. I took another step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The space between us was shrinking too fast. Without thinking, I reached for the revolver holstered at my side, a precaution I always took when working in isolated areas. My hand trembled as I pulled it out, raising it toward him, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to sound in control. "Don't come any closer." The man froze. His eyes widened as they locked onto the gun. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might back down, that he'd realized things had gone too far. But then, he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, eerie, and filled with something that sent ice down my spine. "You think that's gonna help you?" he sneered, taking another step forward. "Out here, you're just as alone as I am." I didn't wait to figure out what he meant. My hands shook as I fired a warning shot into the ground near his feet. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed across the empty desert, scattering birds from the brush. The man flinched but didn't stop. His twisted grin widened, his eyes gleaming with something almost amused. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. My brain screamed at me to move, to run, to get out. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and bolted. I sprinted toward my truck, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. I didn't dare look back. My hands fumbled with the door handle, but I managed to yank it open and throw myself inside. The keys were in my pocket. With trembling fingers, I jammed them into the ignition and started the engine. As I slammed the door shut, I caught one last glimpse of the man through the windshield. He was standing by the dumpster, watching me, that same eerie smile plastered on his face. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning in the loose dirt before catching traction. Dust billowed up behind me as I sped away, putting as much distance between me and that bridge as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The bridge nothing more than a distant, unsettling memory in my rearview mirror. I never went back. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who sent someone else to finish the job. To this day, I don't know what happened to the man under the bridge, and I don't want to know. What I do know is that I came far too close to something dark that day. Something that could have ended in a way I don't even want to imagine. Even now, years later, his face haunts me. That twisted smile, those wild eyes, they find me in my nightmares. And every time I find myself working in some remote, isolated spot, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. That day under the bridge taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, you're vulnerable in ways you can't comprehend. The isolation, The emptiness. It plays tricks on your mind, makes you question what's real and what's not. And sometimes, you come face to face with things that remind you just how thin the line between safety and danger really is. So if you ever find yourself out there, alone in the vast unknown, remember this. Stay aware, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe. Because out there, you're truly on your own, and you never know what might be lurking just out of sight. Over the years, I've stayed in all kinds of motels, everything from cozy and charming little hideaways to places so run down they made me question my life choices. But there's one motel I'll never forget, a small, isolated place on a lonely stretch of highway, buried in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't planned on stopping there, but after hours of driving through endless nothingness without a town or even a gas station in sight, I didn't have much choice. I just needed somewhere, anywhere, to crash for the night. What I found instead was a nightmare that still lingers in the back of my mind. That evening, I'd been driving, hoping to make it to the next town before stopping. But the road stretched on endlessly, winding through empty fields and shadowy forests. My headlights barely pierced the inky darkness, and aside from the occasional road sign or abandoned barn, I had no clue if I was even heading the right way. When I finally spotted the flickering neon glow of a motel sign up ahead, I felt a rush of relief. It wasn't much, just a single-story building with a handful of rooms, a few beat-up cars parked out front, and a faded sign that read vacancy in sputtering, uneven letters. The place looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The walls were peeling, the windows grimy, and the air had a damp chill to it. But I didn't care. I was too tired to be picky. I just needed somewhere to lay my head for the night. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of the tires echoing in the eerie quiet. A faint mist clung to everything like a cold, damp shroud, and the only light came from the buzzing neon sign and a dim bulb above the motel's entrance. I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and headed inside. The lobby was as depressing as the outside. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and a dusty counter was littered with outdated brochures for local attractions that probably didn't exist anymore. Behind the counter sat an old man, hunched over with thick glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as I walked in, his expression completely blank. "I need a room," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me like he was sizing me up. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly and reached under the counter, pulling out a battered leather ledger. His hands trembled as he slid it toward me, along with a pen. "Sign here," he muttered in a gravelly voice. I scribbled my name quickly and handed it back. He barely glanced at it before grabbing a key from a row of hooks behind him. "Room 6, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "No smoking. No pets." "Got it," I replied, taking the key. "Thanks." He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with that blank, unsettling expression as I headed back outside. Room 6 was at the far end of the building, right next to a line of trees that marked the edge of the property. The door looked as bad as the rest of the place. Chipped paint and a barely visible number, but the key slid into the lock easily. Inside, the room was exactly what I'd expected. Small, dingy, and outdated. The bed sagged in the middle, a rickety dresser sat against one wall, and a tiny TV hung crookedly in the corner. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper was peeling, and the whole place reeked faintly of mildew. But it was warm, and after a long day on the road, that was enough for me. I tossed my bag onto the bed, which creaked loudly under its weight, and grabbed the remote. The TV flickered to life, but it was just static. With a sigh, I turned it off and glanced around the room. My eyes landed on a small door off to the side, which I figured led to the bathroom. Sure enough, it was cramped and outdated, with a cracked mirror and a light that flickered like it was on its last leg. After freshening up, I changed into some sweats and crawled into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin. The room was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the distant highway breaking the silence. I turned off the lamp and closed my eyes, hoping exhaustion would knock me out quickly. But it didn't. The darkness felt heavy, the silence unnervingly complete, like the world outside had just stopped existing. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the unease that gnawed at me. Something about the motel, about the old man, about the entire atmosphere, felt wrong. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like tapping, coming from the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat bolt upright in bed, straining to listen. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or a branch brushing against the door. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't random. It was intentional. A chill ran down my spine as I reached for the lamp. The light flickered on, casting shaky shadows across the room. My eyes locked onto the door, and I felt my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to know what was causing the sound. But I also knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I did. Moving slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but I forced myself to walk toward the door. My hand hovered over the knob for a moment before I gritted my teeth and pulled it open. The night air hit me like a wave, cold and damp, thick with mist that clung to the ground. But there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, faintly illuminated by the neon sign in the distance. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching softly beneath my feet. The mist made everything look ghostly, unreal. But then, I saw it. A single footprint in the gravel, just a few feet from the door. It wasn't mine. The print was large, clear, and led away from the room, straight into the trees at the edge of the property. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as I stumbled back into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I turned the lock, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. Pressing my back against the door, I tried to catch my breath, but my mind was racing a mile a minute. Someone had been out there, standing just outside my room. But where had they gone? And why had they been tapping on the door like that? I tried to calm myself, forcing deep breaths and reasoning it away. Maybe it was just some weirdo playing a prank. Maybe one of the other guests was drunk or bored. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something about the situation didn't feel right. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. I crept back to the bed and climbed in, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin like they might somehow shield me from whatever was out there. Sleep was out of the question now. The room felt oppressive, the silence so thick it was almost tangible. I lay there, staring at the door, every creak of the old building sending a fresh wave of anxiety through me. Minutes dragged into hours, each second stretching endlessly. I started convincing myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Then, I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't at the door. It was coming from the window. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The window was right next to the bed, barely concealed by a thin curtain that did little to block the dim light from outside. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently running their fingernails across the glass. I didn't want to look. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to see it. But the tapping continued, persistent and deliberate. It felt almost like an invitation, as if it were trying to draw me closer, daring me to pull back the curtain. I squeezed my eyes shut and yanked the blankets over my head like a kid hiding from the monster in their closet. I told myself it wasn't real. It was just my imagination running wild. If I stayed still and quiet, it would go away. But it didn't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It reverberated through the room, every tap sending a shiver down my spine. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the room transforming into a prison I couldn't escape. I couldn't just lie there, paralyzed by fear. I had to do something. My hand fumbled on the nightstand until my fingers closed around the flashlight I'd left there. Gripping it tightly, I took a shaky breath, trying to summon even a shred of courage. With trembling hands, I peeled the blanket back, my every nerve on edge. The flashlight felt heavy in my grip as I pointed it toward the window. I clicked it on, and the beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the thin curtain that hung over the glass. I could see something behind it, a vague shape, barely visible but undeniably there. It stood motionless, its outline distorted by the cheap curtain, but the sight of it made my chest tighten. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound in the room. For a moment, I just stared, paralyzed by indecision. My free hand hovered over the edge of the curtain, shaking so badly it felt like I might drop the flashlight. Finally, I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. With a quick yank, I pulled the curtain aside. I yanked the curtain aside, the beam from the flashlight cutting through the dark. There was nothing. No shadow, no face. Just the empty parking lot, the mist swirling beneath the faint glow of the neon sign. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my heart still pounding in my chest. I was about to pull the curtain back when I noticed something. Something small, barely noticeable at first, in the corner of the window. A handprint. It was smudged and faint, but unmistakable. A chill ran through me, the blood draining from my face. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. My body went cold, my mind spinning, and I stumbled back from the window, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. I grabbed whatever I could, my keys, my bag, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about checking out, didn't care about anything except getting out of there, away from whatever had left that handprint. My hands shook so violently that I could barely turn the doorknob, but somehow I managed to wrench it open. I ran out into the night, the cold air slapping me awake. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. My hands still trembling as I slammed the car into gear and tore out of the parking lot. Gravel sprayed behind me like a cloud of dust, and I didn't stop until I saw the lights of civilization again, their familiar glow giving me some sense of safety. I found another motel, clean, well-lit, and not too far from others. I checked in without a second thought, desperate for some sense of normalcy. But even then, sleep didn't come. I couldn't shake the image of that handprint from my mind, couldn't stop hearing that rhythmic tapping, echoing in my head like it was still happening. I never went back to that motel. I never found out who, or what, had been outside my room that night. I've told a few people about it, but most just laugh it off. They say it was probably just my imagination, or some prankster messing with me. But I know what I heard, what I saw, and whatever it wasn't a figment of my imagination. Since then, I've spent a lot of time on the road, stayed in a lot of motels, but I always make sure to find a place that's well-lit, near other people, and I never, ever stop at some lonely, isolated place in the middle of nowhere. Because out there, in the darkness, in the silence, there's something waiting, something that will find you if you're not careful. And once it does, you may never escape. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Share your own creepy encounters in the comments. I'd love to hear what keeps you up at night. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and remember, the scariest places are often where you least expect them. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.